Good day, classmates, and good day, ma'am. I am Chubby Brian Young, your reporter for today, and I'm gonna report about these three main topics, which is threat to biodiversity, endangered species management, and lastly, biodiversity and landscape for the week 8 to 9 topics. The first topic of my report is threat to biodiversity, and the first in the list of the threat to biodiversity is extinction. Elimination of a species is a normal process of the natural world. Species die out and are replaced by others, often their own descendants, as part of evolution change. Extinction is a natural process. The rate at which species are disappearing appears to have increased dramatically over the last 150 years. So, in other words, extinction is a termination of a kind of organism or a group of kinds, usually a species. The moment of extinction is generally considered to be the death of the last individual of the species, although the capacity to breed and recover may have been lost before this point. Next is habitat destruction. It's a process by which the natural habitat becomes incapable of supporting its native species. The organisms that previously inhabited the site are displaced or die, thereby reducing biodiversity and species abundance. Habitat destruction or habitat loss, defined as the elimination or alteration of the condition necessary for animals and plants to survive, not only impacts individual species but the health of the global ecosystem. Habitat loss is primary, though not always, human cause. Next is invasive species. Species from another region of the world that don't belong in their new environment. They can be introduced to an area by ship ballast water, accidental release, and most often by people. Invas- Invasive species is most often a non-native species that spread from a point of introduction to become naturalized and negatively altered its new environment. Invasive species are animals or plant from another region of the world that don't belong in their new environment. They can be introduced to an area. The next threat is what is common for our human, which is the pollution. Is the introduction of harmful materials into the environment. These harmful materials are called pollutants. Pollutants can be natural, such as volcanic ash. They can also be created by human activities like plants, minings. We have known that toxic pollutant can be disastrous effect on locals' population of organism for a long time. Mm, pollution can take the form of chemical substance or energy such as noise, heat, or light. Pollution killed 9 million people worldwide. Major forms of pollution includes air pollution, light pollution, litter noise pollution, plastic pollution, soil contamination, radioactive contamination, thermal pollution, visual pollution, and water pollution, which is human activities. The next is population or us people. Human population growth represent a threat to biodiversity in several ways. If our consumption patterns remain constant, With more people, we will need to harvest more timber, catch more fish, pull more lands for agriculture, dig up more fossil fuel and minerals, build more houses and use more water. The core threat to biodiversity are human population growth and unsustainable resources use. The most significant cause of extinction are habitat loss, introduction of exotic species, and overharvesting, which is done with human. Climate change is forcing range changes that may lead to extinction. And also, population growth affect us because of true without true proper education about the biodiversity, if how to how to how to plan perfectly to not disturb our biodiversity. Overharvesting, responsible for the depletion of extinction of many species. Fish stock have been seriously depleted by overharvesting in many parts of the world because of what human does for sardine cans, and also overharvesting I sustained overharvesting can lead to the destruction of the resources, and it is one of the five main activities along with pollution, introduce species, habitat fragmentation, and habitat destruction that threaten global biodiversity today. All living organisms require resources to survive. And lastly, commercial products and live specimen. But there's a lot of threat to biodiversity. But my report that given to me is all about this this threat. So commercial product and live specimen. Harvesting wild species for food. We also obtain a variety of valuable commercial products from nature. Much of these represent a sustainable harvest, but some form of commercial exploitation are highly destructive and represent a serious threat to certain rare species. So comes on my mind that comes in my mind there's an example of this kind of commercial product and live specimen, which is the rhinos rhinos horn. Despite of international bans of trade of products from endangered species, smuggling of firm hides, horns, live specimen, and folk medicine amount to millions of dollars each year. The next topic for my report is endangered species management. Endangered species are those considered in imminent danger of extinction. Endangered species is a species that is very likely to become extinct, like what I've said earlier, in the near future, either worldwide or in a particular political jurisdiction. Endangered species may be at risk due to factors such as habitat loss, poaching, and invasive species. Threatened species are those that are likely to become endangered, at least locally, within the foreseeable future. These any species which are vulnerable to endangerment in the near future. Species that are threatened are sometimes characterized by the population dynamics measure of critical dispensation, a mathematically measured of biomass related to population growth rate. And threatened means it's likely to become endangered within it. Vulnerable species are naturally rare or have been locally depleted by human activities to level that puts them at risk. Depleted by human activities, which is mining area. Vulnerable species is a species which has been categorized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as likely to become endangered unless the circumstances that are threaten its survival and reproduction improve. Vulnerability, vulnerability is mainly caused by habitat loss also and destruction of the species home. Next is a variety of terms are used for rare or endangered species thought to merit special attention. The first one is keystone species have significant effect on ecological function and whose elimination would affect many of members of the biological community. Keystone species is a species which has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance. A keystone species is an organism that helps define an entire ecosystem. Without its keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. And the example of these keystone species are dogs, starfish, gray wolves, and grizzlies. Next is indicator species are those tied to specific biotic communities or successional stage on set of environment condition. They can be reliably found under certain circumstances but not others. A species whose status provides information on the overall condition of the ecosystem and of the other species in that ecosystem. They reflect the quality and changes in environment condition as well as aspect to community composition. I have a two example of this, which is the owl and the frog. The next is umbrella species require large block of relatively undisturbed habitat to mainly viable population. Saving this habitat also benefit other species. Umbrella species are species selected for making conservation related decision. Typically because protecting these species indirectly protects the many other species that make up the ecological community of its habitat. Conservation can be subjective because it is hard to determine the status of many species. An example of umbrella species are leopards, monkey, hares, and boars. Next is flagship species are especially interesting or attractive organisms to which people react emotionally. These species can motivate the public to preserve biodiversity and contribute to conservation. And the meaning of these flagship species are those who an icon or a leaders or a superior of the their species. Flagship species is a species chosen to raise support for biodiversity conservation in a given place or social context. But always remember, flagship species are those species are superior and icon for their own species. And the example of these species are Bengal tigers, giant panda, and the mighty golden lion tamarin. And the next topic is biodiversity and landscapes. Biodiversity and landscape pattern and process are inextricably linked. Maximum biodiversity occurs where landscape patterns and processes are most heterogeneous. Biodiversity and landscape pattern and process. These landscape patterns and process are most heterogeneous, like what I said. These species have caused a decline in native biodiversity of much greater significance than their addition to the biodiversity. Forests have always been important to people. Indeed, forest and civilization have always been close linked. Forests are widely distributed, but the most significant remaining areas are in the humid equatorial region and the cold boreal forest of high latitude. Four ways that a forest or a vegetated area can affect the atmosphere. The four ways are: the solar radiation is absorbed, evapotranspiration, photosynthesis, near surface wind is reduced. The first is solar radiation is observed by vegetation and some is reflected, changing the local energy budget compared to non-forest environment. Forest is a big hub for us because of the radiation that the sun reflect on Earth's area or surface. And the second one is evapotranspiration. It is combined by evaporation and transpiration that transfer water to the atmosphere. Three is photosynthesis. Trees releases oxygen in the atmosphere and removes carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, cooling the temperature of the atmosphere. Lastly, the fourth one is near surface wind. Is to reduce because the vegetation, especially trees, produce roughness near the grounds that slows the wind. The next and last topic is parks and preserves. Ecological and physical island have special ecological quantities, and the island biography concept are used in design and management of parks. And also, edge effect is a term generally used to describe habitat edge. For example, forest edge is usually more open, bright, and windy than the forest interior, and the temperature and humidity are most varied. Landscape ecology is a science that examines the relation between these special patterns and ecological process such as species, movement, or survival. I have in my mind that there are different difference between parks and preserve. And these are: parks are usually purchased to develop an active recreational purpose such as ball fields, trails, water parks, playgrounds, and also parks have an active recreational such as softball, soccer, skateboarding, swimming. And for educational purposes, provides after school programming, manage adult sports leagues, instruct swim lesson or yoga lesson or classes. And for the preserve is it protects and manage a natural feature, conserve a watershed, enhance water quality, provides habitat for an endangered species, preserve historical places or landform. For activities is passive recreational such as hiking, bird watching, walking your leash dog, paddle sports, and for our work is remove invasive plants, restore native habitats, provides nature-based program, and build and maintain natural surface trails. It's important. And that's all for the the parts and preserve topic. So guys and mom, that's all my report. It's all about these three content of mine that given to me, which is the threat to biodiversity, endangered species management, and lastly, biodiversity and landscape. That's all. God bless. Stay safe.